Hi, Stephen Mumford. So Rani's given sort of general overview there, and so I hope some of you've got the handout as well, because if you're at the back it might be very hard to read. But we've got the table on the handout. So I'm going to talk about one of these rows, or maybe it's two or three of them together, but I'm going to mainly talk about emergent phenomena. So there is a view, I don't know if Roger or somebody earlier voiced this view that there's philosophy and metaphysics, what difference does that make? Whereas real scientists do stuff, they change the world, what does philosophy ever change? Now there are some parts of philosophy where I think that is valid, but I think questions of emergence versus reductionism, which I'm going to talk about, are indeed really important, and they affect what we do. And I think physiotherapy is a really interesting case of this. So I'm going to talk you through it because I think there is sometimes a political dimension to what gets called science, what gets called scientific. It's a status that's bestowed upon certain forms of practice that then elevates those practices. And there is then sometimes a political tussle. We don't want to call this thing science, we're going to call that science. And so one thing that I think is or has been dangerous when we've had discussions around evidence-based medicine versus more person-centred approaches is that I've sometimes detected strands where the person-centred can get dismissed sometimes as not quite scientific enough. So there was this phrase touchy-feely, which is nicely ambiguous when we're dealing with physiotherapists, because occasionally touching is warranted. But sometimes it's easy to dismiss other approaches, whereas your evidence-based medicine, you say that's very hard-edged, scientific, it's about objective truth. Whereas if you start talking about person-centred approaches, you could be dismissed as, well, it's just touchy-feely stuff. Is it really scientific? So that's one of the debates, and as we develop the dispositional approach, we've wanted it to be open to more sort of holistic approaches where we can treat what we are treating, or what you are treating as physiotherapists and clinicians. You're treating people, you're not just treating legs or muscles or slipped discs. It's the person you're treating. But now the question is, well, is this just some kind of philosophical touchy-feely thing, not really scientific enough? So we've got quite interested in this issue of emergence because one key question is whether there is downward causation. So we've been talking about causation, and there is a view that all causation is bottom-up. And this is often associated with the more scientific view of the world. So what this means is, and there are philosophers who think this, believe me, there are plenty of philosophers who think this, that if you knew the position of every molecule in a person's body, for instance, or the position of every molecule in this room, and then you knew all the laws of physics, then if you could do all the calculations, merely a practical difficulty they'll say, but if you could do all the calculations, you would know exactly where those molecules are going to be in 10 minutes' time. It's a very, very difficult calculation to perform. But they'll say in principle you can do it because they think that nature has this kind of stratification where you've got physics at the bottom as the kind of underlying fundamental science. And physics then explains a kind of higher level science, biology. So all the truths of biology are explicable in terms of physics. And above that you have a science like psychology. But again, psychology, perhaps, it depends on how the story goes, but psychology can be reducible to biology, and biology can be reducible to physics. And we can tell this story all the way up when we go to sociology, for instance. Now, as I say, there are still many philosophers who think this, and the alternative to it which supports the more holistic approach, has traditionally been called emergentism. So if you believe in emergence, you think that there are higher level facts or properties, phenomena, that may depend on the lower level, but once they've been produced, the higher level phenomena, they have a degree of independence from that which they emerged from. Now this is quite an exciting idea, because what it suggests is, say if you think life can emerge from lifeless parts, and that seems a reasonable idea. So the parts that make up a human body, the very commonly available elements like hydrogen, oxygen, carbon, these are lifeless parts, but if you put them together in the right combination, you can get a living organism. So that's a really exciting case of emergence, life emerging from lifeless parts. Arguably, you have other cases of emergence, like minds emerging from unminded parts. So I've got a brain, I think, and it's got neurons in it, and they're very simple on-off electrical things. They don't think, but I think. So I've got a mind, and it seems it's emerged from these unminded parts. Similarly, some other cases people talk about free will. Have we got free will that's emerged from physical things that are bound by the laws of nature? Are there social phenomena that emerge from the individuals that compose those societies? So it's a very interesting and exciting idea, because the idea is that once you've got that emergent phenomena, it's emerged from a lower base, but it's like it cuts the umbilical cord, which in Norwegian is Navlestrand. Is it? Navel string. Norwegian is a very literal language. Navlestrand. So the emergent phenomenon comes from the base level, but then it cuts the cord, and then it's got a degree of freedom. So this is a very exciting idea, but it has traditionally been dismissed as unscientific, touchy-feely, too philosophical. Well, what's the basis for it? How could you have emergent phenomena that were independent from the underlying basis? And so if you have that reductionist way of thinking, it really feeds into the idea that medicine should go along with this biomedical model, that medical intervention should be low level, they should be pharmaceutical, because we're going to change your biochemistry, and that's going to sort out your depression or something. We'll give you a pill for this, a pill for that. We're going to make all these low-level interventions. Whereas the person-centred approach is talking about high-level interventions. So I suspect we might hear something more about this from Matt Lowe later on. The idea that if we understand some of the high-level stuff that's going on, that could actually have a downward causal influence, and it could lead to changes in the biochemistry. So you sometimes hear this discussion, is depression just a chemical imbalance in the brain? Or is the chemical imbalance in the brain the cause of the depression? So which way around is it? If we think that all causation is bottom up from low-level phenomena to high-level phenomena, you're going to be tempted to say that it's the chemical imbalance is producing the depression. And I think physiotherapy is a really interesting case. So I'm one of the philosophers, what do I know about physiotherapy? But I've spoken to a few physiotherapists, and I've got this idea that there is one view, which I now know is far too simple, that you may think that physiotherapy, out of all forms of medicine, is one of the most apt for reductions treatment, because it's about physical conditions that can be sorted out through a physical manipulation. It's about slipped discs that you're going to put into place. It's about muscles that have torn and need some care and gradual exercises. So it may seem, it's all about that. Whereas people who work take a more person-centred approach, and I hope I'm not stealing any of Matt's cases, because I've learned a lot from some of the cases Matt's talked about, may take a patient who comes in with low back pain that's been ongoing for months and months or years and years, and has not responded to some of these direct manipulations. And yet, if you start talking about lifestyle, stress, you know, is it possible to make an intervention at a very high level that then leads to an improvement at some lower level phenomenon? Now that seems great, but what's the philosophical theory? As I said, emergentism has been around for a couple of hundred years, and it's not that well respected philosophically because it's seen as too magical, airy-fairy, you know, spooky. What's going on? How could it be that the physics doesn't explain everything? So Rani and I have been working on a theory of emergence and demergence, which is what we say down to causation is. Just to put this in very briefly, one of the ideas supporting holism, which we're going to say is perfectly scientifically respectable, it's the idea that there is a very real sense in which wholes are more than sums of their parts. And that sense is that there are certain cases where parts come together into a certain specific alignment where they start interacting and changing each other. And that's when you get the really exciting stuff going on. Let me give a really simple example before you start thinking about more complex cases. Let's take the simplest case in chemistry, H2O. Now, water has certain properties or causal powers which the parts don't have. So water can put out fires. But you cannot use the parts that go into making up water to put out fires. In fact, quite the opposite. They will make fires worse, hydrogen and oxygen. So what's going on when hydrogen and oxygen come together to form water? Well, as we know from very basic chemistry, the parts, the two hydrogen atoms and one oxygen atom, they undergo a transformation. They go through a causal process of bonding, and to be bonded means that they share electrons in their outer shell, where there was previously a vacant space in the outer shell of electrons. Now, through sharing the electrons, they form this stable bond. But given that that outer shell of electrons has such a big say in the chemical properties of these elements, then it changes the causal powers of the whole. So wholes, the causal powers of wholes are not mere additions or aggregates of the causal powers of the parts. That's the key idea, very, very simple idea, which emergentists have not always used in the past. So we've got a causal model of emergence where there's a transformation, and that's the sense in which the wholes really are the units that sort of cut the umbilical cord from the parts that originally went into that composition. Now, unlike some other forms of emergentism, which seemed spooky, magical, they tried to say that the higher level phenomena was inexplicable in some way from the lower level, or unpredictable. We're trying to develop a theory of emergence that justifies the place of the whole, but which is perfectly explicable, naturalistic. If you understood those causal processes that went into the composition, in theory, you could understand how living organisms emerge from lifeless parts. Similarly, the problem of consciousness, how mind emerges from unminded parts, in theory, it could be solved. And there are people who are working on it, and good for them. So it's trying to take some of the spookiness out of emergence and holism, so that you've got a perfectly naturalistic theory that will, we hope, deserve to be called scientific. So there's this political tussle going on, you see. Now, again, we as Roger mentioned, we think that we need to take evidence from a wide variety of sources. So that was good. It's going to include the RCTs and so on. But the key thing that we think, as we've been discussing this over the last couple of years with a variety of clinicians, especially those who've taken more holistic, person-centred approaches, we've met many people who absolutely knew that a holistic approach worked in practice. But what I think has been missing is that people didn't understand how it worked in theory. And that kind of reverses the usual order. People say, well, that's all well and good in theory, but how's it going to work in practice? This is a case where we think we've met many people know it works in practice. How does it work in theory? And that's the role that philosophy can play, because if we see we've got good empirical evidence that it's working in practice and we can provide the theory, then we get a more complete understanding that's general and abstract, but it's also concrete and thank you.
So we've just finished our section with Stephen Mumford here, who's done a great talk on philosophy within causality. And just like to ask a few further questions, if you don't mind, Stephen.
Sure, no problem.
The first one I thought, considering we're in a room full of physios, or predominantly physios, do you find physios difficult to engage in terms of talking about philosophy versus evidence-based practice? Are the concepts something that you find that we use quite confidently or not?
No, I've found it really easy to engage with physiotherapists. So I think that's been a really pleasant surprise. I mean, the sense that we've got on the project, we very quickly started feeling that people were really wanting this stuff. So sometimes philosophers have a chip on their shoulder and think that they don't get enough funding, people don't listen to them enough. But what we found with physiotherapists, that they saw the importance of what we were talking about straight away, and a lot of people have come up to us and said, yeah, we've been thinking about this for 10 years or so, and we're so glad that someone's bringing a philosophical dimension to the discussion. So you're right that there can be challenges in that we often use a different vocabulary. But I think we're all intelligent people, and it's just a matter of explaining exactly what we mean when we use a term like ontology or epistemology. Many people already do understand these terms, but they're still fairly simple ideas to put across. You can explain what's meant by ontology without using that word. So I think it's just a question of making sure the dialogue works.
That's great. I was always concerned that people who use the label as an evidence-based practitioner or a philosopher would maybe be using that as a means to shut down conversation and put barriers up so that we don't have an open dialogue. But certainly that doesn't seem to be the case today. There's been some really open discussion in the questions. Did you feel like there should have been some more questions in the open forum? Did you think that they were valid questions?
Well, I think we're still early in the day, and I think a discussion like this needs time to warm up. People are going to be thinking more. But going back to your first point, I agree that there is potentially something harmful when only one form of evidence is considered to be scientific. So I think that may be the sort of thing you're getting at when you say it can shut down the debate. So one of the ideas behind the Cause Health project is that we be more pluralistic about forms of evidence. So we're not saying that randomized controlled trials are not a good form of evidence. They often are a very good form of evidence. But the danger is if it shuts down the debate and equates that with science and says anything else is non-scientific. So we do want to open up that discussion and consider plural forms of evidence, plural methods in science. So one of the things we've been working on is a position that we would call methodological pluralism. And this is a philosophy of science that accepts a wider variety of forms of evidence.
So where does that end, do you think? So I labelled this question as trying to be clever. Which came first, the philosophy or the science? And is current methods of empirical research equipped to deal with the concepts that philosophy brings to the table? And then, if it is, does that not raise more philosophical questions, and does it not then become cyclic?
Indeed. I mean, if you're informed by the idea that science could one day be complete and we've answered every question and there's no need for any further discussion, then I'm sure you're going to be disappointed in your lifetime and probably quite a few generations to come. But no, I see human knowledge as it's an ongoing process. It's like we need scientific theories to make stuff happen, but the theory's constantly undergoing repair and development. So there's this old metaphor of trying to stay afloat on a boat while you're repairing the planks as you go along, right? And there's leaks coming in and you're having to patch them up. And I think in that process of knowledge development, it really helps if you have philosophy and science working together. So one is very abstract and theoretical, the other is more concrete, but I think that a complete understanding of the world has got to be both abstract and concrete. It's got to be theoretical and applied. So there are, occasionally you hear some people who think that you don't need philosophy or you don't need science at all. Stephen Hawking has sometimes said derogatory things about philosophy, for instance. But I really don't want any animosity between these two approaches, because I really think that a full account of reality needs them both.
It's interesting because there seems to be a common theme for the metaphors that I use. They seem to surround water, and you brought something up that was really interesting in the talk about the water molecule having a different function than the component parts of hydrogen and oxygen.
Yes.
And I thought to myself, as a clinician, does it really matter that I understand the fundamental principles between hydrogen and oxygen, or is it more important that I understand that water puts out fire?
Indeed. So in a way it doesn't matter. So one other thing I talked about when I was introducing that discussion, there is a view which some people think is the genuinely scientific view, that everything is reducible to physics, and if you just understand where all the fundamental particles are and you know the laws of nature, then you can predict where a person's going to be in 10 minutes. Now, for a start, that's completely impractical, but another point is that we have a perfectly good theory for predicting where people are going to be in 10 minutes. So I knew people were shortly going to be up here having lunch, and it wasn't physics that allowed me to predict that, it was psychology or some of my awareness of social facts. So the point of the analogy with water, so one thing that I've been working on with Rani Anyam very recently is trying to find a philosophical account of emergence. And the idea there is that wholes can have causal powers which are more than just the sum of the powers of the parts. So the water molecule illustrates that, because water does things that hydrogen and oxygen couldn't do. So there's a transformation when they come together. Now you might think, what's the relevance of that to healthcare? Well, we deal with persons, you know. The person is the subject of medical science, and persons have thoughts and beliefs, and that affects what happens. Take one very well-known case, the placebo effect. There's no point trying to understand that in terms of biochemistry or fundamental physics. Placebo effect works because someone has a psychological state. They believe they may have taken a drug. And even if the drug, even if it was just a sugar pill, it wasn't really a drug, there was no active ingredient in it, that belief can affect somebody's biochemistry, they can affect their health. So I think it's really important that we understand emergent phenomena, because I think philosophers haven't done a good enough job of explaining how there is emergent phenomena in the world, then it can sometimes be dismissed as it's not scientific, so it's not a legitimate part of the discussion.
Yeah.
And that can be very harmful when you're coming up against people who are more reductionist, who think every medical intervention should be a pharmaceutical intervention, for instance, that there should be a pill for everything. Well, no. If we have a more person-centered approach, then I think you're thinking more of lifestyle changes, you know, relieving stress, improving sleep patterns, and so on. And this can have a big effect even on very physical, mechanical things like our joints and low back pain and things like that.
It's certainly something that seems to be coming to the fore in physiotherapy, and that's something that I think I'm personally keen on learning about more. So if there is anyone else out there who's watching this or listening to this who wants to learn more about you and what you sort of have in terms of the emergence theory, where can they find out more about you or that theory?
First place I'd say is have a look at the Cause Health website. So, and that links to all members of the Cause Health group, and it's quite a large network. And then it'll link to the individual research of those people.
Brilliant. Thanks very much for that, Stephen.
You're
really
welcome.
enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Cheers.